Minister Steinmeier, Minister de Maizière, Mr. Secretary General Sagnier, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Good morning and a very warm welcome to Berlin and the Weltsaal of the Federal Foreign Office at this early hour. And thank you for coming to the OSCE-wide conference on preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. I will say a few words about the conference a little later, but right now, and first of all, it is my very personal pleasure to invite this year's Chairperson in Office of the OSCE, Federal Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, to the podium to deliver his keynote speech. Minister, the floor is yours.
Verehrter Herr Kollege,
dear Minister Thomas de Maizière, dear Secretary General Sagnier, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies.
ich sage Ihnen alles ein herzliches Willkommen.
So, a warm welcome to everybody here to the Weltsaal of the Foreign Office. And as you know, crises, conflicts, violence and terror, we are all living in tempestuous times at the moment. And so much was clear to all of us, even in Berlin here, when we took on the chairmanship of the OSCE at the beginning of this year. But how violently those storms in the very first days of our chairmanship were going to crash over us was something that perhaps we didn't quite realize last year. So, ladies and gentlemen, on the 12th of January, just hours before we were going to ring in our chairmanship in this very room, a lethal terrorist attack happened in the heart of Istanbul and claimed many lives, including many German lives. Since then, we have had so many more attacks, Ankara, Brussels, Stavropol in Russia, and this list isn't exhaustive even in the OSCE area. All of us here in this room realize that global terrorism is one of our greatest challenges. And it is a challenge we face together because terrorism by groups such as the so-called Islamic State is directed against everyone, anyone who wants to live in freedom without any oppression on the part of a state or a religion, anyone who lives in the OSCE area, in the Middle East, in Brussels, Paris, Istanbul, Tunisia or Beirut. It is directed against Christians and atheists, Jews and Muslims, and it is intensely fundamentalist and fanatical. And we also realize that just as this terrorism is comprehensive and fundamentalist, we have to be just as comprehensive in countering it. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is something that we are only going to be able to achieve if we work together on an international level. And it will only succeed if we look at all levels in countering terrorism. And that means criminal prosecution. We need to look at how it's financed and how they recruit into their ranks. And particularly, and this is what we're going to talk about in this conference, we need to look at the root causes of radicalization, perhaps more than we have in the past. I'm convinced we need an across-the-board approach. And that is why we are committing, Germany is committing to the anti-ISIS coalition. And that involves military means as well, because that's necessary. But it's not just a military question. We need to stabilize the areas which have been liberated from the ISIS terrorism, because we need to implement the important UN resolutions and work with these areas which have been freed from the terrorist threat and freed from the need to ally with terrorist groupings. So we need to implement these UN resolutions, which are so important, which are designed to stamp out the organization and financing of terrorist organizations. We are committed to stopping terrorists and extremists from coming into our countries, for example, through a better exchange of PNR data. With the instrument of the so-called Advanced Passenger Information, API, we have an effective instrument which we want to develop further. But as you know, not all OSCE countries use that yet, and that's something we need to change. And I'm pleased that an expert from the IATA, International Air Transport Association, is here today with us to shed light on this project, if you have any questions about that. In all these areas, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are working round the clock. But to be quite honest, even that, I think, will not be enough. In order to stop terrorism in its tracks in a lasting way, we need to look at the political, social and economic causes of radicalization and extremism. And we need to do more than in the past in terms of taking preventive measures. Prevention will be decisive. Prevention means that we need to focus on the areas where the dangers are greatest of radicalization, where people have no prospects, where there is no structure for peaceful living together in a multicultural society, and particularly where young people are likely to be reached by the propaganda of terrorists and might be recruited or enlisted into their ranks. This is where we must help to improve people's prospects and life chances and education, and to ensure they have more of a stake in society. Prevention also means that we must offer our values in exchange for the inhuman propaganda of these terrorist organizations. And here the OSCE can play a very important role, because this acronym VERLT, Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism and Radicalization that can lead to terrorism, this is something which the OSCE has been focusing on for years. And this is something that we reiterated in the Ministerial Declaration of 2015. And I recognize that the OSCE has also committed itself to a comprehensive approach. It's about the ability of the participating states to counteract terrorism and at the same time to promote structures based on the rule of law and respect for human rights. This is a multi-pronged approach where the OSCE can play a leading role in enhancing prevention. And I've looked at this myself. In Tajikistan, for example, there are OSCE experts who help parents to recognize at an early stage whether their child has been attracted by radical forces. And I was able to go to Tajikistan a few weeks ago, and I heard about the work of this organization, and it's very impressive work. The OSCE experts are reporting on how important it is in these countries to work with parents on prevention. Social media, as we know, play a very important role in our day and age, and here again we need to use social media as instruments in our fight against extremism. And the OSCE is keeping up with this with its campaign on United in Countering Violent Extremism. They have reached over 6 million people already through this social media campaign, which is an excellent approach that we should further extend. And this is what we should be talking about in this conference over the next day or two. We need to have an exchange about how we can reach young people in the best way, and we should also look at the radicalization of women, a phenomenon which is perhaps new and of great concern, and we need to focus particularly on that. There might be some specific approaches. We need to explore things because we don't perhaps know enough about how to counter that and work on strategies together. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm convinced that we will only be successful in the fight against terrorism and extremism if we work together in the OSCE participating states. For example, when it comes to the UN Action Plan on the prevention of violent extremism and implementing that plan, I'm convinced that the OSCE, after all, which is the biggest UN regional organization, can play a particularly important role. Others look to us to take a lead here. And we also realize that just at national level, we are not going to be able to win this fight. Preventive work can only succeed if all forces in society feel involved and participate, from associations, local representatives, to indeed religious communities. So I am delighted that there are so many non-governmental organizations represented here at this conference, and we look forward to an exchange with you. But we all know as well that the OSCE participating states aren't going to be enough on their own. We need to bring in the Muslim communities of North Africa and the Middle East as well. They need to do what is necessary, not for us, but above all for their own protection. In conclusion, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when the Frenchman Antoine Léry in November lost his wife in the Paris attacks, he sent a very clear message to the terrorists, a message which moved thousands of people very much. He said, "You've taken the life of an extraordinary, special human being. The love of my life, the mother of my child," he wrote, "but you're not getting my hate." And I think that Antoine Léry is right. The terrorists shouldn't get our hate, but we are not going to allow terrorism to destroy something which we have, which is freedom and democracy, and we should not allow terrorists to wreak havoc through our capitals, our capital cities, and kill people. All these people in Paris who had their whole future ahead of them, who were destroyed in that bar. The force of our reply, our response, must be stronger than hate, and it depends on our determination to work together in unity and to cooperate. So let us send a very clear, strong signal from Berlin today on that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, preventing and countering violent extremism involves many parts of government and other institutions. But in all participating states, the ministries of the interior are key to our success. It is therefore my particular honor indeed to introduce to you Mr. Thomas de Maizière, Federal Minister of the Interior, and to invite him to address the conference. The floor is yours.
Lieber Kollege.
Colleague Frank Steinmeier, Secretary General Zanier, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Wherever you may look in the world, there are conflicts, crises, and wars, and a quarter of a year since the end of the Cold War, they seem to be increasing rather than declining. And where structures that lend stability are lacking, fanaticism can germinate, and this is a vacuum in which extremism can spread. And if we're talking about extremism, we're actually using a collective term for lots of different political aspirations. Extremism has many faces: religiously motivated extremism, right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism. But one thing all extremist movements share is an aspiration to turn against the standards and rules of a democratic state governed by the rule of law, against moderation, balance, and compromise. In the process, they use ideological claims to absoluteness, a rigorous friend-enemy mindset, and a crude ideology of conspiracy. And as different as political extremism can be in its objectives, it has this also got different manifestations, but some things are shared. An uncompromising nature, fantasies of supremacy, an aspiration to force their enemy to bow to their view of the world. And we can only combat or counter this totalitarian behavior with a wide range of measures, a sort of 2x2 formula, if you like, preventative and repressive on the one hand, national and international on the other. And that might seem to make sense, but it's not that easily done. So firstly, let's look at the national approach. Without national measures, measures on the ground, we're not going to be able to reach the roots of extremism nor counter extremist excesses successfully. And this requires awareness raising and critically engaging with people on a political level, measures for prevention and de-radicalization, as well as consistent criminal prosecution and an emergency response. All manifestations of extremism, and this brings me to the second point, have increasingly international components to differing degrees. And this requires an international response. It's hardly a coincidence that we're debating violent extremism, radicalization, and terrorism in such an international forum as this. I'm going to use the term terrorism for the first time because not all extremists are terrorists, but all forms of terrorism grow on the soil of extremism, if you like. Terrorist organizations cleverly exploit the achievements of globalization and international connectedness. So-called Islamic State responds quickly. It is capable of learning. It adapts to change. And so-called IS means that international terrorism has taken on a new manifestation. It has grown within a few years from a local Al-Qaeda spin-off, if you like, to the embodiment of global terrorism. The Paris and Brussels attacks have shown us once again just how closely connected internationally terrorists are. Here we saw fighters smuggled in by IS with returnees from conflict zones and local radical Islamists all working together. And these are very different scenarios than we saw with Al-Qaeda attacks, with hit teams that came from outside our borders and carried out attacks. In its advance in Syria and Iraq, which seemed in the beginning to be relentless, has actually, what we've seen in recent months is that IS has suffered significant setbacks. Whether we've turned the tide here remains to be seen, but I think in a sense we're seeing an asymmetrical shift with increasing threats to Europe potentially, but all of this remains to be seen. At the moment, the IS seems to have the capacity to inspire great loyalty in people with experience in combat and a high propensity to violence. But we're also seeing fewer people leaving Germany to join the IS. And if IS and Syria and Iraq are being squeezed out and losing power, then we'll have to focus even more attention on the returnees who are coming back to Germany and Europe, extremists. And there's a very good reason why we'll be looking at the issue in session 4 tomorrow of reintegration and rehabilitation of foreign terrorist fighters. Some 4,500 people, possibly 5,000 people, have traveled from Europe to Syria and Iraq to join the fighters in one function or another. 810 from Germany alone. If these people now return, there is clearly a high risk of violence coming from them. These are people who have gone very far away from our open society and who have spent time in a parallel world which has led them to feeling alienated, to becoming brutal. These are people, there are people who come back who never wish to use violence again, but there are others who come back who have learned to hate and have learned to kill. And I see this as particularly critical for Germany against the background of the growing Salafist group or potential group here. And this is why European and international cooperation, not least in the form of an exchange of data about potential terrorists and foreign terrorist fighters, is so crucial. One of the focuses of the Counter-Terrorism Conference here is the role of youth in preventing and countering violent extremism. And this is an issue that is very close to our hearts as well. What is the breeding ground for extremism and hatred of democracy? No one is born radical. Radicalization is a process. Whether it be right-wing, left-wing, or religious extremism, the patterns seem to be much the same, only the semantics change. But there isn't just one radicalization process or just one reason that leads to radicalization. and our analyses confirm this. The group of those who allow themselves to be blinded by the propaganda of terrorist organizations is very diverse. Among those who have left Germany, we see Muslims and converts, good schoolgoers and students, as well as people who've dropped out of school, unemployed people, people with a petty crime background. Many of them are young, and they're even becoming younger. The share of girls and women is also increasing, and this will be an issue that we'll debate this afternoon. We recently experienced a 15-year-old girl stabbed a police officer in Hanover after she provoked a police check, and the radicalization of this young girl began when she was only 11. Her brother was a foreign fighter, and her mother was desperate. The question remains as to why. Many radicals say that before they joined this new family, if you like, they felt treated badly, nurtured by a sense of not really belonging to society. A wish emerged to have a sort of counter-identity, a new sense of belonging, a new sense of strength emerging from a place of weakness. In this process, factors that can play a role include looking for simple answers to the questions of our complex times, a wish for recognition and acknowledgement, but also the fact that we haven't really learned nonviolent conflict solutions. Dubious, charismatic leaders, targeted internet propaganda, previous contacts in prisons, but also certain mosques and their communities can be catalyzers in the radicalization process. For a while, we thought that the internet was the true driver of this type of radicalization, but in the meantime, we're aware that this isn't it, really. It's always people that are the triggers here, although the internet is, of course, a radicalization accelerator in this process, if you like. But what does this mean for us? Civil society, the state, politics. Well, one thing is clear, and I think we would all agree on this, and I'm speaking to you here as the Minister of Interior. Understanding security in a purely repressive sense is not going to fly. Though without repression, we're not going to get there either. Security has to bring various aspects together. We have to have prevention, which is sometimes seen as the softer approach, combined with resolute criminal prosecution. And early on, Germany has begun with comprehensive prevention measures, offering advice centers for desperate mothers and sisters. Interestingly, these are the ones who are worried about radicalization. Giving them an anonymous hotline is useful. It tends to be the mothers and the sisters who call this hotline. It's not the brothers and the fathers so much. And of course, we have to look at how we can strengthen democracy and tolerance in society as a whole and ensure that people get a sense of participating in society more. And we want to raise awareness among youth who are at risk of radicalization. We want to make them immune, if you like, against the myth of the IS, which the reality of which proves quite different than the myth, as a scene of barbaric killing, ethnic cleansing, a place of oppression, brutality, and traumatization, and hardly delivers its promises. Extremism affects every society. It crosses every border. It affects us all. And this is why cross-border exchange, like our meeting today within the framework of the OSCE, is so important. The most important response to ideologies that preach hatred are strong ideals, informed people who are actively involved in political and social life, and ensuring that particularly people with an ethnic background find their place in our society. At the end of the day, it's about social cohesion, about a community that is enthusiastic about its liberal democratic values and takes a stand to protect them. I wish you every success.
Ladies and gentlemen, as this is an OSCE conference, I would now like to invite the Secretary General of the OSCE, Mr. Lamberto Zagni, to take the floor and to tell us how the OSCE is united in countering violent extremism.
Minister Steinmeier, Minister de Maizière, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm also pleased to welcome you all to this 2016 OSCE-wide Counter-Terrorism Conference on preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. I wish to thank the German OSCE chairmanship for hosting us and giving such high political profile to this event. The presence here today of representatives from more than 55 countries, 17 international and over 60 civil society organizations shows that the momentum we're building to strengthen our joint efforts against terrorism is not fading. Quite the contrary, it is growing. It also shows the convening power of the OSCE. Our organization continues to provide the bridge and the platform for dialogue to address a host of challenges that OSCE participating states face together and should seek to respond to collectively as a security community. I have taken keen interest and active role throughout 2015 in the countering violent extremist process. I attended the White House Summit on CVE in February last year and the Leaders Summit on countering ISIL and violent extremism hosted by President Obama in the margins of the General Assembly of the UN in September. And earlier this year, I also addressed the Geneva Conference on Preventing Violent Extremism, hosted by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Swiss Foreign Minister Burkhalter. I have used these opportunities to underscore the key role that the OSCE and other regional organizations do play and can further play in support of international efforts to prevent violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism. The OSCE Secretariat has been leading the way in close collaboration with ODIHR, the other executive structures, and many other partners, organizing national policy seminars as well as expert thematic roundtables, including on youth engagement and gender aspects. We have also developed a guidebook on community policing and countering VERTL, and good practices on women and countering violent extremism adopted last September by the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. The Secretariat is now championing the campaign OSCE United in Countering Violent Extremism, which I launched last year with Serbia's OSCE chairmanship. We're also driving a new OSCE initiative called Leaders Against Intolerance and Violent Extremism, LIVE, to build capacity of civil society leaders to speak up and to mobilize their peers and communities against violent extremism leading to terrorism. And I would like to salute the financial support pledged by Germany and the United States to both these endeavors and call on other participating states to extend their support as well. In addition, we're now planning to hold one of our security days involving mayors to compare notes as to challenges and best practices in addressing a number of social and security challenges, including those of marginalization and radicalization in some of the large cities in the OSCE area. A week ago, I submitted to the OSCE Permanent Council a comprehensive report on preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism, on past, current, and possible future activities of OSCE field operations. The report highlights a number of innovative activities by the organization's field operations, such as social media training on counter-narratives supported by the OSCE mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina, or a country-wide Parents Against Terrorism campaign supported by the OSCE office in Tajikistan. Soon we will have a meeting of our heads of missions in Central Asia where the main theme will be to develop a broader regional strategy on countering violent extremism. And these are just a few examples of the things we are doing. There is a clear potential for field operations to do more, building on their programmatic engagement in many areas beyond counterterrorism, such as promoting community policing, tolerance and non-discrimination, good governance and democratization. This potential of all OSCE executive structures and field operations needs the support of participating states to be fully realized. We must translate the strong consensus among participating states on countering terrorism into concrete and adequately funded OSCE activities, building upon the momentum that led to the adoption in Belgrade last December on a comprehensive declaration on preventing and countering VERT. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, The adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2250 last year shows that there is growing consensus on giving youth a more prominent role in addressing peace and security issues, including in relation to countering violent extremism. Consistent with this approach, youth features highly also in the OSCE Belgrade Ministerial Declaration on preventing and countering VERT, as well as in the UN Plan of Action to prevent violent extremism. It is particularly fitting that the German chairmanship encouraged the inclusion of youth representatives in all delegations to this conference, and I'm very pleased to see many young people with us today. I'm sure that youth engagement will be a key theme throughout our discussions, as well as during the many side events that will be held today and tomorrow. We should involve young people as partners in our efforts, tap into their creativity, and encourage them to use their energy to protect their peers, families, and communities against violent extremism. To foster this engagement, we will launch today a drawing contest for young artists and designers as part of our United CV campaign. We're asking them to challenge the binary, black and white thinking that often underpins violent extremist narratives. We need all of you to help promote the campaign and this competition. To conclude, I wish to underline that the OSCE has a strong narrative of shared security, human rights, and democratic values that is most effective antidote to violent extremism. We need to redouble efforts to turn this vision into reality for everyone, first and foremost for young people. Thank you very much.
Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, dear colleagues. Those of you who were involved in the 22nd meeting of the Ministerial Council in Belgrade last year will have noticed that the motto of our conference picks up the title of the Ministerial Declaration that the Council adopted on 4 December. In that declaration, OSCE ministers underlined a number of points that inspired us when our conference team, together with the Secretariat, drafted the agenda of our conference. The Ministerial Declaration pointed out that if we want to prevent violent extremism, we must indeed take into account a large number of factors, social, economic, political, and other, that may engender the conditions which terrorist organizations can exploit. It expressed concern that youth, and in fact children, are being radicalized to terrorism and recruited as foreign fighters, and it called on participating states to engage and empower youth in order to withstand the terrorist lure. It called on states to integrate a gender perspective into efforts at preventing and countering violent extremism. It stressed the fact that it is basically our societies at large that must engage in countering the violent extremist narrative. Families, communities, youth, political figures, religious, cultural and educational leaders, institutions of all kinds, and the victims of terrorism, not to be forgotten. And finally, it called on OSCE member states to follow, when countering violent extremism that may lead to terrorism, a multidimensional approach that fully respects human rights and fundamental freedoms. Ladies and gentlemen, we have put these points on our agenda for the coming 2 days because we are convinced that we need a deeper analysis of these issues. And what we need even more is plenty of good ideas and insights inspired by our own practical experience. What works in our societies and maybe what doesn't and why? The conference comes at the right moment because just after the adoption of the declaration last December, the Secretary General of the United Nations has published his own plan of action to prevent violent extremism, which shows us that we are in fact operating not only for ourselves, but in a global context. To kick off our discussion in the opening session, we have invited two important international partners of the OSCE, namely the United Nations and the Council of Europe, to share their view with us. I'm very grateful to Mr. Petko Draganov, the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and head of the UN Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy for Central Asia. And I give him the floor to share his experience with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Secretary General Zani, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to be here in Berlin and participate in the conference on preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. And I'm grateful to the OSCE and the chairmanship for the invitation. Today's topic is both relevant and timely. The spread of radicalization and violent extremism is a threat to peace, stability, and development globally. It seeks to manipulate the media, distort religion, and violate borders by the very nature of its illegal transnational activities. Recent events have demonstrated that attacks can be carried out anywhere and take various forms. Violent extremists are posing a direct assault on the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They undermine our collective efforts to maintain peace and security, foster sustainable development, promote the respect for human rights, and deliver much-needed humanitarian aid. They now control territory, resources, and populations, and are able to blur borders between sovereign states. As Special Representative of the Secretary General and head of the United Nations Regional Center for Central Asia, I can confirm that Central Asia is not spared by this growing phenomenon. Extremist organizations actively seek to recruit new followers using every arsenal in their power, including the internet and social media. And in this regard, let me offer a Central Asian perspective on the phenomenon, and I'm glad to see that there are representatives of Central Asian countries here as well. In the past few years, my center, in cooperation with the Counter-Terrorism Implementation Task Force, has worked with Central Asian partners primarily through implementing the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. A joint plan of action for Central Asia under the global strategy was adopted in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, back in 2011. And based on this strong commitment by Central Asian states, we cooperate with them in building their capacities. In the framework of our regional project, funded by the European Union, we have conducted a number of events which allowed for the exchange of best practices and capacity building on the role of the media, the role of religious leaders, and the role that border management plays in countering terrorism. Let me add here that in this process, we closely cooperate with the OSCE, especially its Transnational Threats Department. And last year, for example, we co-organized a successful regional event in Ashgabat on countering terrorism at the border. All these activities have an impact, and more recently, in March 2016, at the request of Central Asian states, we organized in Almaty, Kazakhstan, a regional seminar on recognizing and responding to radicalization that can lead to violent extremism and terrorism in Central Asia. The event brought together Central Asian government officials and representatives of public associations, international and regional organizations, observer states, and experts on countering and preventing violent extremism. Our Central Asian partners from both governments and civil society underlined the need for more research and analysis to be carried out on the phenomenon, particularly regarding the drivers and triggers of violent extremism, which need to be better understood in the region. This being said, a certain correlation between economic vulnerability, exclusion, and the lack of social justice and human rights violations on the one hand, and violent extremist ideology on the other, was acknowledged by participants. There was a wide recognition that violent extremism is something that should not only be combated, but primarily prevented. And Central Asian participants gave examples of their respective preventive efforts. This focus on prevention is crucial and has to constitute a core element of our long-term commitment. During the discussions, we also noted an increasing number of partnerships between governments and civil society, reaching out to communities to empower youth, women, and religious leaders in preventing and countering the phenomenon. The UN encourages such initiatives, meant to raise awareness, sensitize, protect, and involve these groups using their potential as agents of change. A variety of programs put forward by governments and non-governmental actors in Central Asia focus on countering radicalization and violent extremist messages online. Monitoring the internet for extremist ideology content and preventing online recruitment, especially of young individuals, was assessed as a top priority. In this context, there is also a growing understanding that an effective response would require, beyond direct counter-narrative messages, proposing alternative, positive messaging. It was also noted that denying the use or access to internet should be limited and targeted so as not to erode the freedom of expression. More generally, discussions targeted also underlined the need for a balanced approach, which does not limit the exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms or restrict democratic space. We heard our Central Asian partners' request for support in developing informed and evidence-based national strategies and plans on the prevention and countering violent extremism. Cross-border and regional initiatives bringing together relevant government agencies and NGO networks need to be designed, and we will certainly be considering this possibility as we continue our work in consultations with other international and regional organizations. This regional encounter touched upon crucial and strategic issues related to preventing and countering violent extremism, and in many ways echoed the ongoing discussions in New York and around the world on the United Nations Secretary General's recently presented plan of action on preventing violent extremism. The Secretary General calls for a comprehensive approach to the phenomenon, encompassing not only essential security-based counterterrorism measures, but also systematic preventive steps to address the underlying conditions that drive individuals to radicalize and join violent extremist groups. The preventive approach, which lies at the heart of my mandate, is increasingly being shared and embraced by our partners. And today's event, which I feel privileged to attend, represents a useful opportunity to come together and explore avenues of collaboration in preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Draganov. Our second special introduction today comes from the Council of Europe. Mr. Jan Kleijsen is the Director of the Information Society and Action Against Crime of the Council of Europe. And he will tell us, hopefully also a little bit about a new legal instrument that is being developed by the Council of Europe. Mr. Kleijsen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Daesh has clearly demonstrated its capacity to strike. But Daesh can never win. It can never defeat solid democracies based on the rule of law and human rights. But although they cannot defeat us, there is a risk that we will defeat ourselves by responding to fear, by lowering our own standards, by setting aside essential requirements of the rule of law and human rights. The Council of Europe believes that we should not fall into this trap. Therefore, we assist our 47 member states, as well as many others, in their efforts to prevent and suppress terrorism, while at the same time fully respecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Our action pursues two crucial objectives. First, to strengthen the legal framework against terrorism, and second, to prevent violent radicalization, in particular in schools, prisons, and on the internet. And I'll say a little bit more about those in a moment. As to the legal framework, in record time, a mere 7 weeks, we prepared and adopted an additional protocol to our Council of Europe Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism, known as the Warsaw Convention, on foreign terrorist fighters. This is the first legally binding text to give concrete follow-up to United Nations Security Council Resolution 2178. To date, it counts already 31 signatures, including the European Union as such, and especially at this conference, I would like to stress it is open to all. It aims at the key element of any strategy against terrorism, namely prevention. The terrorist attacks that were committed in Brussels, Istanbul, Paris, and elsewhere were perpetrated by foreign terrorist fighters who returned from Syria. They were already known by police forces. Information was available, but it was not exchanged. Therefore, the protocol foresees a 24/7 network of contact points for the exchange of police information in real time. Only 2 weeks ago, meeting in Sofia, our foreign ministers called on all member states and other signatories to expedite the designation of these national contact points pending the entry into force of the protocol. And we look forward to discussing with as many of you as possible this afternoon at 10 to 2 at a side event in the Adenauer Saal how we can best do this. The most successful tool, as Minister de Maizière reminded us this morning, is for terrorist propaganda and other purposes, is clearly the internet. He called it an accelerator. Websites, social media, and other internet services are clearly abused for terrorist purposes. And especially young people are vulnerable. To effectively counter the abuse of the web and other internet services, we believe that cooperation with the private sector is essential. And we're setting up a formal platform to enable such cooperation. As already mentioned, next to the internet, prisons are a preferred recruiting ground for terrorists. Therefore, we adopted guidelines for prison and probation services regarding radicalization and extremism. It recommends specific measures to be taken in a prison context to prevent persons from being radicalized, as well as to detect, manage, and resettle radicalized persons. A practical handbook for prison staff is now being prepared. Currently, we work on three further legal instruments. A recommendation on terrorists acting alone, a recommendation on special investigation techniques, and a new convention on offences against cultural property, since we know that trafficking in cultural property is a major source of income for organizations such as Daesh. We will also tackle radicalization of women, and I'm very pleased to note that the OSCE, which is already at the forefront of international dialogue on this, is dedicating a special session to this. States and international organizations alike can only be effective in the fight against terrorism if they cooperate closely. This very timely conference, very well organized by the German chairmanship of the OSCE and the OSCE colleagues, is an excellent opportunity to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, terrorist organizations are flexible, adaptive, and quick, but surely we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gleisen, and thanks for the caption that I have taken down, that the true danger is not that we could be defeated, but that we defeat ourselves. That is, I think, a good motto also for this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we still have a couple of minutes, but I think it doesn't make much sense if we enter into a discussion right now. So I would rather like to give you an extended coffee break so that you have a chance to discuss among yourselves, and then come back, please, on time at 11:15. As you know, Germans have a reputation for loving punctuality, but I'm afraid the only thing worse for a conference than a German chairman is a German chairman who uses a Swiss watch, which I do. So please be here on time at 11:15. Thank you very much and have a nice coffee.